Drug developers, investors, researchers, and corporate executives wrestle weekly to understand what is happening in commercial development of NASH medications. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Stephen Harrison, C-suite veteran Peter Traber, and forecasting and pricing guru Roger Green as they discuss the issues affecting the evolving NASH market from their own unique perspectives on this week's edition of Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, surf's up. Exit 24 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami starts now. Just to start, wasn't Digital ILC fantastic? Kudos to EASL, who figured out how to put this together. A group of presenters and session chairs that figured out how to interact and keep everybody involved. And on a smaller scale, our surfers who were attending sessions at 4 and 5 in the morning, local time, depending on where in the U.S. you lived. Not you, Louise, not you, Joern. And then jumping on a 2-hour recording session 10 hours later. 2 days later, I've mostly recovered. I think we've got varying reports from the rest of the gang. Donna walking the dog in the rain, Stephen saying he needs another week. The rest of you will see about as we go along. Okay. In addition to the 5 regular surfers, we're fortunate that Joern Schattenberg was able to come back and join us again today. Joern, great to have you. Thanks for being with us. And then just one more thing before we get started. I want to thank you, our listeners, for staying with us through this coverage. Including today, 5 of our 6 largest days since the cutover are the days since last Thursday when we recorded our first pre-session. We've had 400 listeners check in so far to listen to this podcast from 21 different countries. Thursday's preview was our largest 24-hour audience until Friday. That was our largest 24-hour audience until Saturday. Y'all slacked on Sunday, but it's been pretty good. We've grown over 20 people in the LinkedIn bulletin board, and we now have actually Vlad Ratziu is joining us as well. Hi, Vlad. How are you?
Hello, everyone.
So we now have Vlad with us as well, which is superb. So what we're not going to have today is any music because I suspect this session may run a little bit long, and we'll have enough to do anyway. We'll be back on next week. On to the podcast. Let me start with this, just throwing it out to the group. Different question than we usually have. What was the one thing you liked best about Digital ILC? Brave one, go first.
I loved being able to sample so many different tracks, so many different types of presentations and areas of liver disease without running from hotel to hotel, jumping in cabs, Ubers, and the like. And so being able to hear so much more of the science than I normally would was really exciting.
I enjoyed being on my computer and being able to go and pull up papers that I might have on my computer, do searches about the presentation, and kind of learn across the whole medium while I was listening to presentations. So I found that to be a useful way to work.
Yeah, I found myself multi-channeling. I like that digital channel setup, and I actually flipped back and forth. And I think it was a little easier than changing meeting rooms. But on the other hand, as mentioned before, you really miss meeting people in between sessions, you know. So I think both ways, but clearly in the future, I hope to meet in person.
I think I share both Donna and Joern's perspective on the conference. But the other thing I liked was being able to spend time with the posters. And some of the posters had presentations with them. And that I very rarely get to do when I go to the international conferences because there's just too many people usually around the poster. And you try and read quickly to try and get in the information so that you can move on to allow somebody else close. So I think that I enjoyed really well this year.
I would echo everything I've heard. So 3 major things I really liked about it. The ability to flip back and forth from one presentation to the next without having to run from one venue to another venue and being stopped along the way. Now that's pluses and minuses because you have these mini network sessions that occur while you're running from one place to the other. But for the purposes of just seeing a lot of content, it really allowed me to see more content. In fact, I would make the argument of maybe the past 5 years, whether it's EASL or AASLD, I saw more content digitally than I did in person. Also, I'm up close and personal. Like I'm looking at the slides from a foot away, maybe 2 feet away, rather than in some instances being in the back of the room. The other thing I thought was intriguing was that having had to do these lectures, I was held to a 10-minute hard stop on my recording, which gave everybody 5 minutes for Q&A, and it really opened up the opportunity to interact, whereas in a real live venue, many times speakers go over their 10-minute allotment, and there's only time for 1 or 2 questions. I think there was a lot more interaction that happened because of the digital platform. Having said that, I've got some things that I don't like about it, but we're not at that point yet.
Vlad, you're in a position yet to talk about the one thing you liked about the event? I know there are things you had issues with.
I don't know about many things I liked about the event other than not having to travel. I think it's absolutely terrible. I totally miss learning from discussions with others. I totally miss the whole ambiance, the whole thing of people, going to the microphone, asking questions, discussing with someone sitting next to you about the result is just being projected. I think it's terrible. It's really bad. Of course, I understand you can do a PubMed search at the same time, but you can do that at ASLD as well. They have Wi-Fi. You have your computer on your lap. Honestly, I think we learned so much less. And it's not only the meeting, it's also when you meet people on the corridors, in between the meeting rooms, it's outside the convention center. There's so much more opportunity to discuss the results, to hear what other people say. Also, a lot of people are not interested in asking questions just by sending a text message. So you won't find these people. For instance, I didn't do it at all. So it's a lot of opportunity lost. And it will be very sad if we have to move that permanently to this type of meeting. Very sad. I mean, it will lose a lot of interest. Let's just publish the papers now.
Add one thing to Vlad's points, which I absolutely agree with. Because we had several people from the Global Liver Institute attending, we had set up a Slack channel just for discussions, during the meeting. Sometimes several of us were attending the same session. Sometimes we were in different sessions, sharing, screenshots, comments, thoughts in real time. So, it created an interesting little, interesting feedback loop and discussion group as, it wasn't quite as good as, whispering to the person next to you, but to the point of creating some, not attending the meeting alone and in isolation, it did solve a small portion of that.
I think there were both pluses and minuses. The two things that caught me as pluses, number one was, Peter and I actually talked about this during the session at one point. I think there were more questions. I'm not sure that's a good thing or a bad thing, but there are people who are shy about getting up and going to a microphone, or by the time you think of the question and go to the microphone, you've moved on, and as Stephen pointed out, there might not be time at the end. So it felt to me like there were more questions and questions coming faster. And then a small selfish thing, which is that I can't take notes except on my computer. And the ability to take notes on the deck as it was going on actually left me better organized when it was done.
Roger.
Yeah.
Roger. There were more questions, probably, but the questions weren't necessarily better. And here's why. When you have people like Stephen, like other guys that go to the microphone, ask the question, formulate it in an elegant way, you get much more things that are expressed, asked, and conveyed through the question than just writing 1.5 lines. And some questions are too complex to write in 2 lines. So I think you do get possibly more questions because there's more time, as you said, but those questions aren't necessarily the most interesting ones because they have to be formulated in a short Twitter type style.
There are things from that might be worth bringing into this, and then things to learn that we need to learn how to do better. We get to figure all that out as we go along, because at least the next couple of events will be digital. Hopefully people will learn as they go along, but I think EASL, for not really having a roadmap or rule book to work from, I think that it did an admirable job of anticipating what they could and going forward. We had one question that came in from during the bulletin board that I wanted to share, and I wanted people to comment on, and then we'll go to the episode itself. Okay. This is from Ian Rowe in the UK. That he wasn't sure the clinical endpoints were the only way put clinical trials together, and his comment was, the evidence we have indicates that this will likely overestimate the true benefits of treatment to patients. In terms of reduction of clinically meaningful endpoints, decompensation, HHC, and liver-related mortality as patients die from competing causes. The current treatment paradigm, in my view, envisions bespoke treatment with a specialty price tag. The magnitude of the likely benefit to patients with F3 or less is likely to be modest and more akin to primary prevention strategy for heart disease, like a statin, where high-volume, low-cost drugs are king. If the trial designs don't fit the problem or the final market, how will clinicians know how to use the drugs? And how will patients be able to understand what benefits they might get from treatment? I want to throw that out to you folks and see what thoughts you have on that.
I think that's ignoring the value of time. Even stopping progression of fibrosis allows us time for a variety of interventions, whether that's, lifestyle or PO or what have you. I'm not just a liver patient, I'm also an IBD patient. And, throughout the past 3 decades, I have been so grateful to be just one step behind the latest innovation. And now, having been on every class of IBD drug and maybe needing the next, they bought me time to the next innovation, time for some interventions that have, sustained me. And so I think the question has too narrow a focus and ignores the value of stopping progression and giving us time.
As a metastatic melanoma survivor, I definitely agree with that. When I got sick the first time, close to 10 years ago now, my comment to my wife was that all we had to do was keep me alive long enough for the drugs to catch up. And eventually they would. Now, I was fortunate. I wound up doing okay even before the checkpoint inhibitors arrived. But I totally agree with you that if you're in a severe situation, what you're really rooting for is to stay one step behind science. Other thoughts?
I just had another thought, but it's more in agreement with Donna's point on time. And the more we can get to early diagnosis or early location, the longer the time those individuals have, because there is a certain quality of self-care, self-wellness, that they can instigate those lifestyle changes with support. So the earlier that we locate disease, whether or not it's through cardiovascular routes, type 2 diabetes, a lot of these came up during the conference, but the more we go for early location, the longer the time becomes and the greater the effect that the patient can have or the person can have on their own health to even extend time longer while we come up with new techniques, new treatments. So I suppose that supports a lot of what Donna was saying there. But I understand where he's coming from on that.
Yeah, I would agree with the comments made by Donna. We see people all the time where we're just trying to extend, how we're trying to help them, but at the same time, by having them in a clinical trial, whether the drug is working or not working, we're able to continue to dialogue with them routinely about lifestyle modification. We're able to better assess where they stand with their liver disease, if they're progressing, if they're staying stable or they're regressing. We have a better handle on where they are in their disease process. So I agree with the comments made.
With that, why don't we dive in? We have sent out, just for the audience, I sent out a note to the surfers offering everybody a chance to respond to one of 4 questions. I'll read you the 4 questions. And then I think we're going to start with Joern, only because Joern's the only person, maybe in the history of this podcast, who never got to answer at the end of an episode what he found most interesting. No one got to answer on that episode, but the rest of us have done it before. So I think, Joern, we'll start with you if that's okay. Here are the 4 questions. Number 1, what one thing did you believe heading into Digital ILC that you believe more strongly now? 2, conversely, what one thing did you believe heading into Digital ILC that you now question most strongly? 3, which of the presentations that you personally discussed on the podcast do you feel will have the greatest long-term impact on how we diagnose and treat fatty liver disease, and why? And then 4, from where you sit, what one unresolved issue might we actually answer in the next year or 2 that will have the greatest potential to improve real-world patient outcomes?
All right, great choices, Roger. Thank you for letting me go first too. I think I'm going to start top up. And what one thing you believed heading into Digital ILC do you believe more strongly now? And I think, looking at all the great clinical trials, the presentations on substances, and the prediction of outcome is something that will be in the main focus. We have to understand which patients do respond to drug to actually subclassify and better define the inclusion into trials moving ahead. And I saw a lot of abstracts. I'm thinking of the resmetirom data that Ruud Lumba presented on the MRI PDFF reduction and prediction of histological response. I'm seeing super responders emerge. If you reduce MRI PDFF by 50%, you do better than you reduce by 30%, and it's the linkage of those surrogates which we know are important in the disease pathophysiology, and now we can actually measure them more precisely. I'm not convinced it's going to be MRI PDFF in the end, but it's a technique that's been run in all these trials, and I think we'll end up with a composite score, potentially combining, artificial intelligence, a magnitude of imaging and blood-based biomarkers. Now, I know that's hard for the regulators, but we'll have to better understand the complexity of the disease that's pathophysiologically interacting at various levels. We'll have to use some markers, combine them potentially with artificial intelligence to predict which patients will respond to outcome. And I think after Digital ILC now, seeing data also from the post-hoc analysis of the obeticholic acid trials, Jérôme Boissier presented data on NITs there to understand how the course of NITs is. They didn't show the linkage to the histology data yet, outcomes, but I think that's one way moving forward that I do believe stronger, and we're closer to defining patients that do respond to drug.
Just to add something to this, I think all these abstracts that have shown that attempted to show changes in NITs in these well-designed clinical trials. This is, of course, extremely important to see whether in a trial setting the NITs are tracking histological changes. But it's very important also to understand that there are several levels of analysis here. And most of the time what is presented is just how did the marker change between beginning and end of treatment in the active arm versus placebo. And since you know that the active arm improves histology, say, and then you show that the marker goes down in the active arm versus it doesn't change in placebo, you say you go for victory. But that's not a very good way of testing whether a marker is appropriate for that purpose. What is truly needed, in addition to this analysis, would be to look whether responders defined histologically and non-responders differ in the kinetics of these non-invasive markers. In other words, does the non-invasive marker stay the same in non-responders and is reduced in responders or not? And that regardless of the treatment arm, and in particular in the active arm, because that would be the only thing that would make it useful in clinical practice. It doesn't serve any purpose to know if a marker goes down if you don't know whether you can trust that to predict that the person was a responder. And this type of analysis it's not yet presented for most of these abstracts. And it will be extremely important to know. And once you know that, once you have shown that indeed there's a difference, the two curves diverge, the one in responders dives more than the one in non-responders, even that is not enough to make it a truly, to make it a tool to predict response. You would have to determine thresholds to measure how sensitive it is, how specific, and all this methodology for diagnostic tests. And maybe you can make a test out of it, maybe not.
Yeah, and I'll further that a bit. This is Stephen. So think of alpha-fetoprotein for liver cancer. It's not elevated in all people with liver cancer, but if it is, and you ablate the tumor, you resect the tumor, you treat the tumor, and alpha-fetoprotein goes down, not only is it a marker of regression of disease, but as the marker comes back up, it's a marker that disease has returned. And that's another place we need to take these biomarkers. You put somebody on therapy, you follow their non-invasive test, you show that it goes down by the magnitude of effect size that we know is linked to histopathologic improvement, and then you stop the drug. And then you can use that marker as well, hopefully, to show that once it reaches a certain threshold, we need to reinstitute therapy, or we need to change therapy, modify therapy, add therapy, or do something. So it's a little bit of an extension, taking that non-invasive test, not only to show that it's linked to improvement, but also that it's linked to recurrence down the road. I think that's ultimately where we need to be with these NITs.
Yeah, I have two additional thoughts after, listening those comments. And I think, both Stephen and Vlad, of course, right on. I think we'll see subgroups emerge, a little bit like Stephen mentioned, maybe the XY positive NASH subgroup that you can follow with a certain marker. And then, as Vlad said, a lot of those markers are diagnostic markers that we use to select and include patients into clinical trials. So I don't think that FIB4 is going to give us the prediction of response in the end of the day. We'll need a prognostic or pharmacodynamic marker that is potentially unrelated to establishing the diagnosis. So it'll be important to, think in those different NIT categories.
Okay, Peter, I promised you'd go next, so why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Roger. I'm going to take just a step back and look at where NAFLD is in the context of the liver meetings from the perspective of looking at it over an entire professional career. In my view, and I'm going to give you the bottom line up front and then tell you a little bit why I say that. So I believe that we've kind of reached an inflection point in NAFLD. We all know that there's been a dramatic increase in the number of papers and so forth published over the last decade at international liver meetings. But what I see now in the field is kind of a broad, consolidated approach to NAFLD. And I think we're really at an inflection point in the thinking and potential therapeutic approaches. So I started attending liver meetings in 1985 when the AASLD was held in a single ballroom in Chicago. The focus at that time was on physiology, biochemistry, and later molecular and cellular biology of normal liver processes. And we had careful descriptions of disease, but very little therapeutics. Of course, all that changed with hepatitis C. In 1989, the hepatitis C virus was identified. In 1998, we had interferon and ribavirin approved, and diagnostics continued to advance. And then in 2013, a long time after the discovery of the virus, we had direct-acting antivirals that were approved. And now hepatitis C is in a global consolidation process with the focus on bringing therapy to everyone with a disease and get closer and closer to a total cure. As we've seen that happen, we've seen the rise of NAFLD and the issues related to that. Now, let me just, I looked up a few numbers. By 1990, there were 39 articles with steatohepatitis in the title. 39, that's it. By 2000, there was 417. At that time, there were over 17,000 articles with hepatitis C in the title. By 2010, there were 3,800 steatohepatitis, and this year there are 11,000. And there's still not even close to the 110,000 hepatitis C articles that are out there. So there's been this big shift. Everybody recognizes it. So why do I say I see this year, maybe last year, as kind of an inflection point? What I'm seeing is a true consolidation of efforts around NAFLD. We're seeing patient advocacy like Donna's group. We're seeing medical and government groups getting together and thinking about disease awareness. We are seeing primary care doctors and hepatologists and tertiary care focus talking together and trying to increase disease awareness. I'm not saying there's not a long way to go, but we're seeing that really develop. Non-invasive testing is being looked at kind of across the board. Experimental therapeutics, clinical trials of novel therapeutics. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of genomic and personalized targeted medicine being thought about and brought to bear. And what I am seeing from a historical perspective are some of the things that I saw with viral hepatitis C, where lots of different groups are coming together and focused on a disease with a large unmet medical need. You know, this past weekend might not have been the exact inflection point. This year, last year, and going forward, I think we're seeing an important shift in our focus on NAFLD. And I believe, frankly, that it bodes very well for accelerating and rapid progress in the area. So I thought I'd just give that bit of a historical perspective, having seen this liver field grow over the years.
Don, I see you nodding.
That was a wow and a thank you for putting that in context. That was really fantastic, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Donna.
I think I have to agree. I mean, having spent the last 30 years not living primarily in liver disease, but at different points in my career working with clients who are in different diseases, you get these moments when things start to explode. And usually the proliferation is proof that investment and focus will lead to results on a different level. And I kind of had that feeling at NASH in January when people talked about how much bigger NASH was than it had been the year before, not just bigger, but also more diverse in terms of who was there. And I certainly track that point when you talk about this meeting. I don't have your 30 years of experience, but it feels like the right pattern. The stream is clearly getting wider and the water's going faster.
Peter, this is Stephen. Thank you for that historical walk through where we've been and where we've come with both Hep C and NASH. I would say to your inflection point, maybe just a comment followed and embedded in that as a question. It seems to me, looking back on hepatitis C, that the real inflection came with the approval of a drug, because then the marketing campaigns began, the real outreach to patients and the real push into GI offices to use therapy and subsequently even to primary care. And my hope was with fatty liver that we would hit that point this year, and unfortunately that did not happen. So I guess it's a question in the sense of, do you think that the real next push will be when there's an approved therapy, because there will be a huge marketing campaign behind it? And the reason I ask that to you is because, you know, one of the things that I still feel like is unresolved, the presentation GS08, General Session 08, it was from the UK, and it was the primary care clinics basically showing us that we're still doing a really poor job of identifying these people early. We're doing a poor job of identifying them late, but certainly not picking them up early. And there's just so much work that still needs to be done there. And I feel like through all the efforts that patient advocacy groups are making, like Donna and Wayne, and then the work that Louise is doing, and the efforts that we giving lectures and talks and all that, ultimately is only going to get us so far. And we're going to need to have the drug rep in the office holding up the flashy monograph showing these figures and showing therapy before we really reach critical mass in identifying, even 30 or 40% of people with disease.
Stephen, I think that's a very good point. And I, like many others, are disappointed that we don't have an approval of the first drug in NASH this year. I think that the inflection of approval of interferon and ribavirin was a very, very important step, although I never particularly liked treating my patients with interferon, but we all did. But I do think that the energy around the disease was maybe put into a bright light with the approval of the first drug, and then industry got involved. But even before that, after the identification of the virus and widespread, RNA testing and so forth, there was a crescendo of activity. And what I'm seeing in the field today, from at least from my perspective, is an enthusiasm across various areas which will yield important results that will end up with approval of a drug in the near term. But I do agree with you that that will be a huge catalyst.
You know, I also want to underscore Stephen's point, because I agree with the essential premise. But in addition to that, I've heard so many doctors, not only in this context in NASH certainly, but in general, say, if there's not something that I can do, I don't want to diagnose. And so a lot of the barriers to screening and identification of patients and linkage to care come from not having an approved therapy for NASH. And so that cultural shift and that understandable physician wanting to have confidence that there is something concrete that they can do for their patients to be effective and successful while they're doing their jobs is also a reason why the marker of having an approved drug is such an important catalyst.
So Donna, I completely agree with that. I think, however, that one thing that's changed that will actually make the work that people like you and Louise do even more important than it's been in other disease areas is if you go back to Stephen's image of the sales rep with the glossy visual in the doctor's office, fewer sales reps get into doctor's offices. When they do, there's less time for the glossy visuals. So the traditional modes of education to take this story to primary care aren't going to work nearly as well as they have in the past. And what that's going to rely on is the energy and momentum that comes from patients and allied professionals pushing the story into the doctor's office and putting the doctor in a place where they need to learn to stay up with where their patients are. Now, I believe that also will happen a lot more when there's a drug, because the people who get hope more than anyone else when there's a drug are patients.
Can I put something into the mix that's coming from a different angle, following what Peter was saying and Stephen is? Do we think that we've heard a lot of figures this week? Donna commented on 150 times more cost of a patient with fatty liver disease on the top of a patient with no fatty liver disease, or a person with no fatty liver disease. A percentage increase, and 87.7 billion forecast between 2015 and 2025 is the additional cost of obesity on society and healthcare in Australia. The fact that this is an overwhelming problem financially, do we think that there is a chance that sort of insurers are going to take this on because they are hosing money on patients by not finding them, their quality of life, days work lost, and just general poorness? They have more sick time. So whilst we look at the few that we get to see that come across our doorstep as physicians and nurses in healthcare, the majority stay outside, driving those costs up. And we all know that obesity is forecast to go 63% increase by 2030. So do we think there could be a push from the other side to try and help these people rather than the medical side?
Payer conversations have become more difficult when the approval process got stalled. 2 years ago, I remember having a conversation with a world-renowned economist to help me think through how to paint the picture and tell the story of the urgency of identifying and treating patients with NAFLD and NASH in an instance where so few patients are currently in the system incurring costs, or at least costs that are captured as liver costs, as NASH costs. And so for many payers right now, NASH shows up as a zero. and any intervention or treatment is more than zero. So how do we make a case for economic savings when right now there is very little spending that's identified as for NAFLD and NASH? That's the conundrum. As we can capture more of those costs and appropriately categorize them as NAFLD or NASH related, it will be easier to make that case to payers, whether they're private or government, that there needs to be action. And so that is the sort of economist's dilemma that I've been wrestling with for the past 2 years.
If I can jump in,
please.
This is a fantastic discussion, and all of you made very important points. But just two things regarding the explosion of information and studies on NASH. It makes no doubt that a lot of this has to do with therapy, and the ultimate pickup in society has to do with the availability of drugs. And therefore, all these things that happened this year were at great risk that this might put a halt on the whole process. So we have to be extremely careful about that. The situation is very fragile. And it is fragile also because we have specific challenges in NASH that we might not have had in HCV. One of them is that you can't cure NASH as you cure HCV. So the curative aspect of a treatment adds enormous value, and people are ready to pay a lot because they know that there's cure and the cure is definitive. Now, another thing is that not only there is no cure, but a lot of these diseases are sort of preventable too. And when you have a preventable aspect to management, it's a whole new equation to write and to solve if you want to stress the importance of drugs in particular. You know, outside this circle of specialists, when you go out there at large in the medical community, people said, we already have treatments of NASH. Is exercise more, eat less, eat better, be less sedentary, and that's the best exercise for NASH. And it's true that as a preventive measure, it works really well. The problem, of course, being once you get the disease in individuals that have comorbidities, it doesn't work well at all. But it's very hard to fight against that. So that's another thing that you didn't have truly with HCV and HIV. Another thing is that while we as hepatologists, and maybe some infectious disease specialists, saw most patients with HCV, we as hepatologists do not see most patients with NASH. They are actually scattered across different specialties. So it is very hard really to get a sense of the whole work that needs to be done, the whole reservoir of population, the severity of the disease. We don't see a lot of the cases, including those that are severe. So all this makes it a very different scenario from the viral hepatitis, of course. But the strongest catalyst is, of course, whether you have drugs that change the natural history of the disease. And if you don't have these drugs, I'm very afraid that the situation we're in can go backwards, and people might lose a lot of interest for the reasons I said. No curative treatment, preventive strategies that are effective. The second comment is about cost. So it's here again, very difficult to find out what part is proper to NASH and what part is proper to comorbidities. When you say obesity increases tremendously health costs, yes, it does, but that we know for a long time. We know that obesity, diabetes, heart disease that comes with it increases the cost. The problem is how much is the liver per se adding to those costs. And here you hit another problem, which is that unfortunately, maybe that most of the costs for the liver, in fact, are at the cirrhotic stage. You don't spend so much money at F0, F1, F2, F3, other than monitoring, and monitoring practices are not that expensive. So we have to figure out a way to understand better the costs, direct or indirect, knowing that they're not uniformly distributed throughout the early stages of the disease. So it's a very complex situation, and it's still a very fragile, equilibrium. But we're going in the right direction, but we have to be aware of those shortcomings.
I'm thinking intensively about what Vlad said. A lot of things I'm echoing, and I agree with his statements. It's always that I'm disturbed when I speak to colleagues that tell me, your patient should exercise more and eat less, because it feels to me as a hepatologist that's not the reality that I'm faced with in my patients, and I know that it's if I just tell this my patient, let him go, he'll have a variceal bleed or progress or whatever. So I think the few patients we're seeing as hepatologists who are at risk, we really need something for them to offer beyond the good advice and structured prevention. Yeah. So while I think Vlad is right, I'm always frustrated a little bit with the reality that I see in clinic.
I remember an early conversation with Wayne Eskridge, who, we all know as a cirrhosis patient from NASH, who, has been successful in controlling his disease through, diet and exercise intervention. But, early in his advocacy, I emphasized to him, for some people, all the olive oil in the world is not going to cure this, is not going to make them better. It's not going to be successful. And so it's not an either or, it's an and. And I think as he's evolved in his advocacy, he has, come to recognize that.
Donna, I wanted to ask you, based on what Joern said, it seems in my practice, in my experience, it's very surprising. Paradoxically, my patients, if you tell them just go out there, eat better, exercise, they're not happy. They're unsatisfied with the answer. Mm-hmm. They say, I don't eat much. I only eat salads. I'm going 2 times. I'm running 2 times or 3 times a week. So in my experience, but here's the question I'm asking you: is it the same from your point of view, from the people you dealt with? Patients want medicines. And they sort of trust you more if you give them medicine than if you just give them some sort of vague dietary and lifestyle measures. And it is paradoxical, but this is what happens. Maybe there is a bias in the type of patients I have. But do you all have this experience?
I think, Vlad, that you're unfortunately absolutely correct. I remember a conversation I had with a 30-year-old Marine, actually, who was mad. He was visibly upset, and he said to me, like, are you serious? Like, all there is diet and exercise? And I was like, well, it's not only, and, when done, at a certain level, it can be helpful. But yes, people are not only, resistant to the idea, partially because they hear, diet and exercise, message, from everywhere all the time anyways, but there is an expectation that medicine will have more for them. Is that a reasonable expectation to have? Not all the time, but I think you're absolutely right. That is the context. I think of it, and I talk to to patients throughout my own journey, certainly as someone who has benefited a lot from medications and surgeries and therapies of various types. But it's my obligation, I feel, as a patient to give the science, give the medicine the best opportunity to work. So if I can do everything I can on my side, in terms of diet or exercise or what have you, I think that's sort of my part of the partnership, my part of the equation, to add to the medicines that are available. So that's how I approach it in talking with people. But you're right, the expectation is there. And in fact, yes, the credibility and trust is there if there is something very concrete, a medicine, a surgery, or something that people can have. Otherwise, why are they going to you?
Yeah, just one quick point. To Donna, to tag on to what Donna said, there's actually legitimate data that's been generated on this, where patients are surveyed about their experience with their physician, their clinician, their appointment, and whether or not they walked out of that office feeling like they were heard and that they had a good experience. And if I remember correctly, if they walked out of there with a prescription in their hand, that they ranked that visit significantly higher than if somebody just told them a couple things to do on the side. And it's amazing to me. I mean, I've even thought about writing down on a prescription pad exercise and the right diet. thinking that might actually help them, reinforce that needs to be done. But it's well stated.
Well, I just wanted to say, Roger, that my only wish would be that I could make a comment that would lead to such a brilliant discussion every week, because I think around the table, everybody has made excellent points, and I would agree with all of them. The only thing I would say is that one opportunity is to expand what we think about physicians and nurses and allied healthcare professionals delivering. Because I agree with you that the patient would like much more to walk out with a prescription for a once daily pill. But I guarantee you, having been a person that recently lost 20 pounds, that if you help that patient lose 20 pounds, when they come back, they're going to be much happier with you than when you gave them a pill. Now, if you don't give them the help and support to accomplish that, I think they're going to be very disappointed. But once they do lose that weight, they're going to be very happy with their physician and their healthcare services in general. So just some, we may need to think about this in a different way.
So two thoughts real quickly. Number one, we've now moved from the Old Testament to the New Testament, which is we've now gone from teach a man to fish versus give a man a fish.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so we're staying biblical. We've just moved to the other side of the birth of Christ. But the second point, which I think is more important, is we treat this like this is a liver issue, but it isn't really only. Okay? Think about the sources of antibiotic resistance and how much of that has to do with people with common colds and viral infections going to primary care doctors and expecting that if they don't get a prescription, the doctor isn't listening to what they're saying, which goes precisely back to Stephen's comment. So we deal with this really all over the society, right? And then you get to the issue of how many people taking statins, at least in the States, I can't speak for the rest of the world, but I assume it's not terribly different. To some degree, their cholesterol goes down, but if their cholesterol drops enough, they use that as a rationale for eating more cheeseburgers, to just pick one noted example. So this whole interplay of what people use medication to do and what they expect from medication and what they expect from doctors is a complicated subject, and it doesn't always work to the best benefit of health.
And I think that's correct, but I also think, picking up on what Donna and everybody's been saying, is different people will respond to different approaches. And I think by teasing out the ones who have obesity as a complicated disease process, and there was quite a few presentations at the digital conference on obesity and its targets and how difficult it is to treat. But if I look back at patients that we treated with interferon and ribavirin, particularly our genotype for heavy Egyptian Arabic population, if you could get them to lose weight, and they engaged in this really well, it improved their outcome of going on interferon. So we would use a right patient, right time, right drug, but we would maximise their chances of cure within all of the data that we had. It was bringing their weight down, really getting the opportunity, and they would go on and statistically do and get their cure. And I think the harder you work for the longer period to get the engagement, actually the better the rewards can be. And there are patients that respond, or people who respond very well to that. And I think getting those patients engaged and then working on the others side who do need medication and do need different approaches, bariatric surgery, or more psychological counselling into their habits, because no one size fits all. It may not be the liver disease we're treating, it's the contributors to the liver disease, which are far more complicated than probably the liver disease itself.
We could let this one go for another couple of hours, but Stephen, you have one you want to contribute?
Yeah, so this has been a tremendous conversation. I do think it's probably worth throwing out a couple other thoughts from the Digital ILC. So we talked about an unresolved issue, which is disease awareness, which is an ongoing battle, and I don't think we've won that battle yet, as was illustrated by several abstracts presented here. For me, I was really intrigued. I want to go to question 3, which of the presentations you discussed on the podcast do you feel will have the greatest long-term impact on how we diagnose and treat fatty liver disease? I'm going to twist that a little bit to say I didn't give this discussion on this abstract, but it was one that was discussed, and that was the Zobair-Yonasi one. Vlad, I don't know if you presented that one or not. I think somehow we commented on it, showing that liver disease actually was the number one killer of a NAFLD patient, which totally flipped a whole paradigm on its head, where we've been preaching cardiovascular disease as the number one risk factor. And it was pretty compelling evidence. Now, granted, it was older data, but it's some of the better data that we have out there to take a look at. So maybe I'll throw that out there to the group to get comments. Are we going to flip the script now and put liver-related death as the number one cause, or are we going to still say cardiovascular disease is number one, with the caveat that there's one study presented in abstract form that says otherwise?
Stephen, just a short comment. Actually, it wasn't all data. It was 2018, if I remember well.
No, that's right. It was more recent data for sure. I got that one confused with the one abstract that showed that GLP use was only in 2% of patients, whereas we know now the reality is in diabetics, about 20% or more of our patients are on GLP-1s. So that one I think was a little outdated.
So my point here would be the following. We are liver doctors. So yes, people die of a lot of things, but we need to concentrate on the cause of liver death and prevent that. Trying to have us in our hands a drug that will reduce all types of cause mortality, it makes no sense. There are cardiologists that know how to treat coronary heart disease for now tens of years. There are diabetologists that know how to treat diabetes and its complications. Our job is not to worry so much about whether we're reducing cardiovascular complications with NASH targeted drug. Our job is to reduce liver-related outcomes and increase liver-related survival with our NASH drug, and let the others do the rest because they know how to do it. They already have plenty of drugs to do that. They have guidelines, they have management strategies. So you have to be modest here. And regardless of what the other cause of death are, the only concern is, do you, by treating the liver with one particular drug, do you increase the risk of death from other organs? That would be bad. But if it's neutral, if it doesn't change it, while still reducing the risk of liver-related death, that is all we need. We can discuss about more, but I think in a nutshell, that would be my opinion.
Vlad, I understand that from a hepatologist, point of view, and certainly agree in terms of, designing, drug development and regulatory process. But as a patient, if I'm dead, I'm dead. I'm less concerned about why I'm dead. And I've had this conversation with other patients as we go back and forth. And I've had this conversation also when I was on the ABIM gastroenterology specialty board and sort of watching, the various sort of factions and facets of, gastroenterology, focus narrowly sometimes on just their part of the digestive tract or just their part of the patient. And it gets very frustrating, tiresome, and in some cases, dangerous when doctors are so organ focused that they lose sight that the patient has all those organs, all those parts, and things work together, and so while you're right in one aspect of it, it sends up red flags and alarms for me as a patient who has gone through a very fragmented healthcare system, and sometimes has fallen, through the cracks into a hospitalization. And I'm just, lucky to be alive. And so I have a concern with too narrow a focus sometimes.
I understand that. However, if you are a patient that has NASH and coronary artery disease, are you going to come to me to fix both problems? Or are you going to come to me for the liver problem and to a cardiologist for the heart problem? If I were a patient, that's what I would do.
I just need you to both have the same understanding of the problem and be on the same page about what you're doing for me and with me. because too often that's not the case.
So Vlad, two thoughts, right? And Stephen. First of all, if you take Zober's paper and you take the paper that Dr. Shalasani presented on Thursday that suggested that a lot of the growth in liver stiffness occurred in F3, you really make it hard to build a case for using a lot of the medications that are out there right now to treat patients prior to F3. Because if liver disease is what we're trying to deal with, and liver disease is what happens after liver stiffness sets in, then the question becomes, why are we worrying about F2? I don't buy that argument for a second, but the economics of that argument the economics of when do you treat and who do you treat start to change, and what do you treat for start to change.
So then why do you want to eradicate HCV then? Why just not treat cirrhotics with HCV?
I think that's where that issue was. And I don't happen to agree with it. I'm talking about it from a policy perspective. If the economics aren't in treating earlier, and if the severe events are what happened in F3 and people are going to die from liver, then you say then the cardiologist doesn't worry about your liver back in F2. The cardiologist figures you can take care of that later. And a lot of the things that we're developing right now become, I think, a little bit harder to promote and get paid for. I don't think it's right. I just think it's what might happen.
In HCV, you're preventing infection and spread of infection to other people. And, if you're curing it at any time, you're, preventing all sorts of complications and things like that. So it's both an individual and a public health solution.
So there are non-hepatic complications of fatty liver disease. And we're very far from demonstrating that if you treat fatty liver disease, you'll have less diabetes or less coronary heart disease or less preatherosclerotic lesions, but it might be the case. So that is one thing. The other thing is that in the end, it's not a matter of when you treat, it's a matter of how much it costs and what are the side effects. If you have a drug that treats NASH that is very inexpensive, no side effects, then it's okay to treat F0, F1s, because that's where you'll have most of the impact in terms of public health, not including just the most advanced ones. That's when you really stop the development of the disease. But if the drugs are very expensive.
But going back to Stephen's comment about Zober's paper, and Stephen, help me or Joern, anyone else, would that paper support Vlad's statement that you want inexpensive drugs in F0 and F1?
I don't think we know yet. We cannot give you that answer. I think from a pathophysiology perspective, I'll always say it could make sense to decrease that NASH, and I don't know whether that patient with F1 today could be a fast progressor and hit my clinic again with a pre-cirrhotic liver in a couple years down. We need those biomarkers I mentioned in the beginning to predict a little bit of the course, which isn't even in all patients. And you mentioned to not treat F0. We don't. There are certain risk factors, and we understand the patient population, but it's very difficult to predict the individual course at the patient level. And Donna mentioned that patients don't want to get lost. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is that we still have to understand the disease. And I just saw a lady again today. She came with F3 to my clinic, and she told me, well, my liver function test went up. The first thing my primary did was stop my atorvastatin. So, we add on the cardiovascular disease here just by having that liver disease. And I think that's a bad thing.
But I think, can I just comment on, and I think Joern was right at the very beginning. He was asking and saying that we're closer to being able to identify patients who respond to treatments, but also the prediction of outcomes. If we take Vlad's comment and look at treating F1 and F2, if we can predict with F1 and F2 with NAFLD, who is going to be the people who cost and go on to develop type 2 diabetes instead of the cardiovascular disease or the hypercholesteremia or the hypertension, and we can tease out those populations who go on to have different problems, then we can directly treat each of those populations. But I think, going on to Donna's point, that we're not siloed in healthcare, and I think the GP, Dr. Pryke, she was very keen on the fact that GPs want help in multi-morbidity management. And there's a lot more multi-morbidity management going into healthcare now with our partners with endocrinology, cardiology, rheumatology and obesity. Because I think there is now an understanding beyond the research populations that we are actually reliant on each other to provide better health care detection, management and treatment to the patient. And if we work individually, that is never going to be, in my mind, the best way to treat somebody. I think we do have to coordinate, but I do understand that we have to be very specific sometimes on a research question, but we're moving this beyond research into populations that are vastly in need over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
I agree. Lest my statement be misunderstood, I'm in complete agreement with that. I think that it's important for us to focus on liver as part of the broader whole. The risk I see is that you can take a couple of these study outcomes and a definition of what we're supposed to focus on and box ourselves and a lot of patients into a corner I just don't think we want to be in.
I think this has been an excellent conversation. I think one of the best episodes yet. And we need to be mindful of everyone's glucose management, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. All right. Then with that, why don't we just go to a final question. I think we all agree this has been a fantastic conversation. Donna, let me start with you and then everybody else. What do you think is the one best or biggest thing that comes out of it for you, the conversation we've had?
Well, it certainly reinforces how we have set up the Global Liver Institute's NASH Council with internal medicine, endocrinology, and cardiology at the table with hepatology from the beginning, because it's going to take all of us to solve this problem.
I can go next. I suppose for me it's being aware to remember that we move research from bench to bedside, and research enables us to hopefully treat people better and get better outcomes, rather than and we can be very narrow in a research question sometime, and it may not be the best care that they get because we're answering the question of the trial, but interpreting it and put it into the real world is actually the skill of where we're trying to take this research to.
Stephen, if you're still here, go next. You still here?
I'm going to be a little provocative. I love the fact that the Atlas trial was presented and that there was a solid effort made at combination therapy. And maybe this isn't very popular with people, but it's going to be said by me anyway. And that is, we need to have more combinations. We need to have more combination therapy. We all talk, Joern and Vlad and myself and Peter and others talk about combination therapy, and that's where we're going to wind up. I firmly believe that. Here's what I want to see. I want to see drugs that are moving the needle in NASH as monotherapy begin to come together in combination therapy. That's not taking drugs that have shown minimal effects as monotherapy and try to hit a home run by combining them with another minimally effective drug. Let's take drugs that are really moving the needle and combine them where it makes sense, looking at novel mechanisms of action that actually augment and harmonize and synergize with other drugs. And so we had that first shot over the bow of the Atlas trial. Now let's magnify and really begin to enhance what we've seen here moving forward.
Yes. This last comment, very interesting, but we still don't know what the best combination is. And I used to think like Stephen, which is if you want to do a combination, take the best players and put them together. The most efficient or the ones that are complementary. One does one thing that the other can't do. However, one of the most successful combinations, Stephen, in hepatology was between a drug that was moderately effective, interferon, and a drug that has almost no antiviral activity, which is ribavirin. And yet the combination did much better than anything else before. So bottom line, you never really know until you test them what is the best combination. And of course, we want to try drugs that are effective to put them together, but sometimes you have surprises. As a general final comment, I think from what because you asked us, general comment on what was discussed, this was really a very nice discussion. And I think it's a discussion that needs to be, again, presented and we need to go over these things again in the next, in the future, because you see how many specific things are there about NASH. Relationship, the natural course of disease, very particular. The fact that it's a chronic disease, you can't cure it. The fact that it depends so much, it's so intricate with other comorbidities that are competing risk of mortality. Do you treat early? Do you treat late? All this depends on all these things. So I think it's very nice to exchange ideas around that, and we're still far from having a consensual view on all these aspects, including what the job of the hepatologist should be in this multi-disease process.
Okay, Joern. By the way, Stephen, you don't have to accept the nomination or decline it. We'll just let that hang out there.
I want to be his vice president if he's president of 4 different big pharma.
You would be eminently qualified, Vlad.
I'm happy to chair the board.
Joern, go ahead.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think, the reassurance that Peter expresses into some of the lead PIs on this talk too is clearly, I think as hepatologists, we know, I raised the question, which patients should we treat, which markers are the right ones. I think we know the disease is real and the patients hit the end stage, and we have a pretty good picture of which ones to select for clinical trials. And I think that's why we're seeing so many good clinical trials being performed. And I really enjoyed in this discussion here the patient perspective. And I think Donna said something where, the patient wants to have this flow all together. And I think in the end, we have to address politics and policymakers a little bit more. As a hepatologist, we kind of know which way we want to go. And I think, we need support in having that NASH nurse or a patient somebody that helps the patient pull these things together, because that's difficult from the physician's perspective.
I think these are all excellent points. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. I'm watching the people who aren't too hungry to speak smiling as we get to the end of this. My only thought would be this, that the reason the company that sponsors is called Hep Dynamics is because systems are dynamic in their nature. And one of the things that dynamic systems yield is the law of unintended consequences. So when I ask questions like some of the things I was asking today, the issue really is we have to understand how all the different stakeholders are likely to take the points that we make, and how those things come together and where the energy is. No one ever gets unintended consequences right. That's why they're called unintended consequences. But the broader a vision we can take as we go forward, the better a chance we have of getting it right, which circles me back to Donna's point about if you can bring all different parties to the NASH Council, you have a much better chance of getting to a conclusion that makes sense and that represents the complexity of what we're dealing with. With that, this has been an amazing. Vlad, I'm glad you were able to join. We didn't expect you. I'm thrilled you were here. Joern, thanks for coming. Surfers, you guys have been amazing. We will be back next week. Until then, special thanks to Mike Wilson, our engineer, and belated thanks to Tom McDonald, who stepped in and did amazing real-time editing for us while we were doing ILC last week, to Buzzsprout, to Eric Rounds, who does our social media, to Paula Teale, who coordinates all the media, Ryan Seguro does our editing, and mostly to you, our listeners, who keep pushing us to get into more interesting topics in more fascinating ways. We'll be back next week. I don't know what we'll be talking about. I'm thinking seriously about Vlad's idea about how often do we bring groups like this back together simply to think about big issues, because I think these are great and really valuable conversations. Until then, everybody stay healthy, surf on, and we'll see you on the podcast next week. Bye-bye now.
You've been listening to Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Send in your questions to surfingnash.com, and our panelists will spend the first 5 minutes of next week's episode answering your questions. Visit us online today, surfingnash.com.